Who was really the first emperor in history? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and every video immerses you in the destiny of those who shaped the world. Today, get ready to cross the veil of time and follow the footsteps of a man who became more than a king, Sargon of Akkad, the very first emperor in history. In the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, he would have united the warring cities, broken the borders, and founded an empire that would mark the centuries to come. Between swift conquests and divine visions, his destiny was forged in boldness and blood. A sovereign by force, a father by legend, he embodied the very idea of imperial power. For millennia, his story has fascinated, but what does it really hide? But before we embark on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and enjoy the journey. Around 2350 before Christ, the world was going through a period of deep transformations. Several centers of civilization were developing simultaneously, often independently, sometimes connected by networks of trade and cultural exchanges. This era is fragmented, with urban and political centers forming according to specific geographical, climatic, and economic conditions. The purpose of this prologue is to provide an overview of the regions that will form the historical backdrop for the figure of Sargon, the first sovereign to claim control over a continuous territory from the Levant to Lower Mesopotamia. Let's begin with Upper Mesopotamia, this area that roughly extends from the middle course of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers to the northern and eastern regions, where the fertile plain gives way to moderate reliefs or plateaus. Mesopotamia is then the cradle of a mosaic of city-states, many of which speak the Sumerian language, considered one of the oldest written forms identified to date. Among these cities are Kish, Uruk, and Lagash, to name just a few of the most famous. Each of them has a system of government in which political authority and religious authority often blur together. Temples, usually dedicated to a tutelary deity, are not only spiritual centers, they are also administrative, economic, and cultural centers. At this time, the distinction between king and priest is tenuous. The Sumerians used the term ensi to designate the governor-priest responsible for a city and its territory, while lugal refers more to a king with military skills more pronounced. In many cases, the same person can hold both positions, provided they have received the assent of the gods and the notables. In the same geographical space, further north, kingdoms with a Semitic dominance intermingle. These kingdoms, of which we know fewer direct sources, coexist with Sumerian cities, trade with them, or engage them in warfare. They speak a language called Akkadian, related to other Semitic languages such as Amorite, and much later, Aramaic. Frictions are not lacking. Access to water, farmland, control of lucrative trade routes, or the hegemonic ambitions of certain sovereigns create a nearly permanent effervescence. It is in this environment, saturated with political and religious strategies, that the figure of Sargon of Akkad will emerge a little later. In Egypt, at the same time, it is the flourishing period of the Old Kingdom, sometimes called the Old Kingdom in French tradition. The successive dynasties build on the banks of the Nile some of the most impressive monuments in history, including the famous pyramids. The IV dynasty, around 2613 before Christ, left behind major constructions at Giza associated with the pharaohs Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. In the period we are interested in, we are rather at the end of the Vede dynasty, during the reign of the pharaoh Djedkare-Isisi, and approaching the Sixth dynasty, whose founder would be Teti. Just after Djedkare-Isisi, we find Pepi I, a sovereign who likely reigned around 2332 to 2283 before Christ. The organization of the Egyptian state is extremely centralized around the figure of the pharaoh, considered a living god on earth, the son of the god Ra, or the incarnation of Horus according to interpretations. The administration is hierarchical, the royal court being composed of numerous scribes who document and manage every aspect of the kingdom's life, from tax collection to monumental projects. The great provincial governors, later called nomarchs, hold a certain regional power, but remain theoretically vassals of the pharaoh. Unlike Mesopotamia, Egypt enjoys a relative cultural and linguistic homogeneity at this date, even if differences exist between Lower Egypt, near the Delta, and Upper Egypt, towards Nubia. In the Indus Valley, located in present-day Pakistan and northwest India, we observe at this time the beginnings of the Harappan civilization. The sites of Kot Diji and Amri, generally dated to the second half of the 3rd millennium before Christ, reveal the stage called Proto-Harappan, characterized by nascent urbanization. The foundations of what will become the largest Bronze Age civilization, with the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, are being established. The engineers of the Indus are then developing remarkable urban planning systems, a grid plan, advanced waste management, and facilities for grain storage. Even if we are only at the genesis of this more centralized society, it is important to know that these communities foreshadow impressive urban achievements for the time. They already maintain distant contacts, notably with Mesopotamia. Seals bearing marks unique to the Indus Valley have been found in Sumerian sites, proving that trade exchanges formed a concrete link between these two regions, despite being thousands of kilometers apart. In northwest, the Fertile Crescent, in Anatolia, roughly corresponding to most of present-day Turkey, and Syria, urban and proto-urban cultures such as those of Tel Brak, Ebla, or Mari are flourishing. At Tel Brak, a key site for understanding Upper Mesopotamia, remains of an influential regional center have been uncovered. Ebla, located in present-day Syria, is then a true urban power, possessing lavish palaces, artisan workshops, and remarkable archives. The clay tablets discovered at Ebla, written in a Semitic language related to Akkadian, mention diplomatic and commercial exchanges with other regions, including southern Mesopotamia and possibly more distant lands. Mari, for its part, is situated on the middle Euphrates in present-day eastern Syria. This city controls strategic routes along the river and maintains intense commercial activity due to its position as a crossroads between the Mesopotamian plain and Syrian territories. It is also an essential place for future political developments. Later, the great kings of Akkad will seek to secure control of Mari to dominate the Euphrates Valley. To the east, beyond the Mesopotamian plains, lies Iran. This region is already the theater of its own political dynamics. In the southwest part of the Iranian plateau, the region of Elam, whose capital is traditionally Susa, sees the structuring of a dynasty referred to as Awan by Mesopotamian sources. The Elamites, having their own deities and an original language system, Elamite, are only intermittently surpassed by Sumerian or Akkadian power, at times vassalized, at times independent, or even conquerors. The Awan dynasty, a declared rival of the Sumerian city-states, is often the subject of military campaigns by Mesopotamian governors, eager to prevent these mountain people from seizing border territories. The mutual harassment between Elam and Mesopotamia contributes to a perpetual tension, fueled by each side's desire for the other's resources. The Elamites, for instance, seek to access the fertile Mesopotamian plains, while the Sumerians, Akkadians, wish to obtain the mineral wealth found in the Iranian mountains, particularly copper and silver. Farther east, in China, we are at the stage corresponding to the end of the Longshan culture and the beginning of the early Tu period, according to some chronological debates, around the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. These societies had developed advanced techniques for millet agriculture in the north and rice agriculture in the south, as well as a sophisticated black polished pottery craftsmanship. Evidence of a more hierarchical social organization is manifested in graves where certain individuals are buried with valuable goods. The great geographic distance of China from the Near East should not obscure the fact that these various civilizations are developing simultaneously with large sedentary communities, early metallurgy, and polytheistic beliefs. In Europe, the Chalcolithic period, which marks the transition between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, sees the flourishing of several regional cultures, sometimes strongly distinct in material and ritual aspects, while in America, the Peruvian coast witnesses the emergence of the Carol Supe culture, considered one of the oldest civilizations in the Americas, with pyramids, central plazas, and a complex social organization dating back to 3000 before Christ. This information, too often overlooked, illustrates the universality of human ingenuity, which, in every corner of the globe, expresses itself in different forms and at different paces. At the heart of all these areas, the climate exerts a primary influence on prosperity or scarcity. Around 2350, we find ourselves in what specialists call an arid climatic optimum. The term may seem contradictory. It is generally considered optimum to refer to a period where temperatures are milder than before, but here it is specified that there is simultaneously a trend toward drying or a global decrease in precipitation in certain regions of the Near East. For the lower valley of the Tigris and Euphrates, the region where so many Sumerian city-states are concentrated, this increased aridity translates into a greater dependence on irrigation networks. Initiating, regulating, and maintaining canals becomes a matter of survival for the populations, and by extension, a major lever of power for the ruling classes. If a king or governor shows the ability to maintain a stable water flow to the fields, strengthen the levees, and prevent catastrophic floods, he instantly gains immense popularity and consolidates his legitimacy. It is also a time of tensions. When water becomes scarce or the river levels fluctuate unpredictably, communities rush to create or strengthen defensive systems to protect not only their crops, but also access to irrigation canals. In a universe where agricultural production depends primarily on the intelligence of the hydraulic network, friction often erupts between neighboring cities. Border territories become contested zones. The slightest modification of a canal or the construction of a levee deemed on another city's territory can escalate into armed conflict. Sumerian tablets, written in cuneiform, recount numerous disputes over water usage and the precise demarcation of cultivable fields, thus illustrating the political dimension of irrigation. These conflicts remain less known to the general public, but they have devastating potential for both city-states and their populations. Despite these rivalries, trade routes have managed to develop and persist, as they are vital for obtaining raw materials. The caravan drivers of the time transported lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone of intense blue, prized both in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and which primarily comes from the Badakhshan region, located in present-day Afghanistan. The journey is long and perilous, crossing plateaus and deserts, but the market value of lapis lazuli justifies such risks. In addition to lapis lazuli, bitumen from Hit, a Mesopotamian locality on the banks of the Euphrates in present-day Iraq, is imported, where natural sources of bitumen have been accessible since the earliest antiquity. Bitumen is then used for sealing boats or canals and can even serve to bind certain stones. Cedar from Lebanon, famous for its robustness and scent, is found in many constructions, whether it be the palaces of Mari, Sumerian temples, or even later in the Egyptian navy. The flows, therefore, have not only an economic dimension. The smell, aesthetics, and symbolism of certain materials, like cedarwood, the ancestor of many legends, feed the collective imagination and the reputation of sovereigns eager to prove their prestige. This circulation of goods is also a circulation of ideas and techniques. The caravan drivers, scribes, and artisans disseminate their know-how. For example, the beer-making techniques, a central beverage in daily life in Mesopotamia, can cross borders. Egyptian artisans learned certain stone-cutting or goldsmithing methods through contacts with other workshops. The domestication and breeding of different animal breeds are perfected through new practices. In this context, Mesopotamia plays the role of a nodal crossroads between Anatolia, Elam, Syria, Egypt, and, more distantly, the Indus Valley. This pivotal position nourishes the intense bubbling of Sumerian civilization, driven to compete in inventiveness. These societies are credited with the first systematic use of cuneiform writing, initially invented to keep accounts of grains and livestock before lending itself to true literary and religious texts. One may wonder how the figure of Sargon of Akkad suddenly stands out with such importance. After all, Mesopotamia had already known powerful kings, and Egypt had a centralized pharaonic system. Yet, what distinguishes Sargon is the unprecedented project he formulates to claim and consolidate a true unified empire, encompassing different geographic areas, cities, and peoples. This sovereign aims to extend his authority from the Levant to lower Mesopotamia, from the shores of the eastern Mediterranean to the confines of the Persian Gulf. This conception of a continuous political entity responding to a single power seems revolutionary for the time. Previously, kings contented themselves with controlling surrounding territories or building flexible alliances. Sargon presents himself as the absolute master of several regions, unifying under his rule the Sumerian and Akkadian cities, as well as some neighboring kingdoms. He thus surpasses the idea of Lugal to rise to the unprecedented status of a sovereign ruling over an enlarged entity. The originality of his endeavor is also evident in the ideological dimension. Sargon does not merely claim to be the strongest. He defines himself as a legitimate king, enthroned by divine will, destined to rule over a unified cultural ensemble. The narratives emphasize his privileged links with the goddess Ishtar, a deity associated with love, war, and justice, showing that he constructs his power on a double legitimacy, military and religious. According to tradition, he would be the first to give birth to the idea of a uniform territorial empire, a space subjected to determined institutions, perhaps speaking several languages, but administrated by specialized scribes and officials. It is not, therefore, a mere temporary domination, but an attempt at lasting centralization through a new capital, Akkad, which would give its name to the Akkadian Empire. The scope of this concept of a unified empire is not only military. It involves a reflection on administration, logistics, taxation, and the ideology of royalty. For it to be sustainable, the empire must maintain peace at its borders, ensure the collection of tributes, and guarantee the smooth circulation of goods and people. Sargon, coming from a divided Mesopotamia between rival political entities, inherits diverse traditions that he fuses into an unprecedented political body. Even if other kings had the idea of gathering large territories, Sargon remains, in Mesopotamian memory, and later in Assyrian and Babylonian tradition, the great pioneer. He is placed at the beginning of a new era, where one man can theoretically be sovereign over a plurality of cities and communities, united by force and law. The prologue on the world around 2350 concludes here. The Near East, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and Iran are not stagnant spaces. They are bubbling with creativity, rivalries, monumental constructions, and innovations. All participate in the urban adventure, illustrated by writing, major hydraulic works, and political institutions. In this already complex backdrop, Sargon of Akkad embodies a major break, the birth of a lasting imperial concept, propelled by a monarch with unprecedented geopolitical ambitions. His name crosses the centuries in literary traditions and legendary tales. He disrupts the notion of royalty and lays the foundations of a centralized state projected over vast territories. This idea remains unique in the political ferment of 2350 and marks the beginning of a new stage in the universal history of power. The time has come to discover how, against the backdrop of Sumerian cities and Semitic kingdoms, Sargon gradually forges a legend that will influence future generations. In the middle of the 3rd millennium before our era, Mesopotamia, the vast region between the Tigris and the Euphrates, is far from unified. It is composed of dynamic city-states, each with its own organization, religious traditions, and specific political alliances. Understanding the history of Sumer before the rise of Sargon of Akkad requires examining the existing political and religious structure, as it is within this framework that subsequent transformations will be inscribed. One must thus analyze the Sumerian politico-religious system, the rivalry between certain cities like Umma and Lagash, as well as the linguistic evolution that sees Sumerian and Akkadian coexisting. The myth of Lugal-Sagisi, the conquering sovereign who heralds the emergence of the imperial figure later embodied by Sargon, must also be mentioned. At the heart of Sumerian political life are two figures, the Ensi and the Lugal. These titles, often mentioned in cuneiform inscriptions, reflect two distinct poles of power, sometimes confused or combined. The Ensi, or governor-priest, leads a city-state under the tutelage of a deity. He manages daily affairs, temple maintenance, and religious rituals. The Lugal, literally great man, is more invested with military and political prerogatives. This function develops mainly in times of threat, which are frequent in a region contested for its resources. Some inscriptions show the confusion between roles. An Ensi is presented as a Lugal, according to the needs of the moment or the will of the sovereign. This duality illustrates the complexity of a political system in perpetual adaptation, according to local circumstances or the ambitions of leaders. To understand the tensions in Sumer, one can observe the conflict between Umma and Lagash, two cities in southern Mesopotamia near the Persian Gulf. Their rivalry, spanning several generations, showcases the difficulties related to the management of hydraulic resources and borders. Fertile lands depend on irrigation canals that are long and require constant maintenance. Access to water thus becomes a matter of dispute that can lead to war. Under the reigns of Akhenaten and then Entemena, tensions escalate. Archives and remains reveal political and religious stakes. Each camp invokes divine protection to justify its rights and claim reparations. The Stele of Vultures, dating back to around 2450 before Christ, celebrates Lagash's victory over Umma, depicting soldiers marching and vultures carrying enemy heads. This monument embodies the staging of power and the sacralization of conflict, two fundamental traits of Sumerian culture. In these cities, religion and politics are closely intertwined. Each city is placed under the protection of a deity, whose temple also serves as the administrative center. The priests, working alongside the Ensi, write inscriptions, record legal acts, and lead the rituals. Major deities such as Enlil, god of the air, or Inanna, goddess of love and war, reinforce the sacred character of political and military decisions. Conflicts are also seen as opportunities to demonstrate the superiority of one's deity over those of rival cities. Thus, the conflict between Umma and Lagash takes on an almost cosmic dimension, with each side claiming divine support and denouncing the other. Language plays a central role in Mesopotamian politics before Sargon. Sumerian dominates the south, especially in Uruk, and Lagash. A language isolate, it is difficult to decipher today. In the north, Semitic-speaking populations use Akkadian, a language related to Hebrew and Arabic. This language gradually gains prominence, especially under dynasties from Kish or Akkad. Around the mid-3rd millennium before Christ, inscriptions reveal the beginnings of administrative bilingualism, with documents written in both Sumerian and Akkadian. A linguistic syncretism emerges. Each city adopts or adapts religious, diplomatic, or epigraphic elements, depending on its alliances or its need for legitimacy. Lugal-Zaggisi marks a major turning point in Mesopotamia. He is often considered the first to partially unify the Sumerian cities under a single authority. Although his reign remains somewhat obscure, he proclaims himself King of Uruk and extends his control over Lagash, and other cities. Some sources claim he unified all of Sumer, making him a formidable conqueror and a rival to any other attempts at domination. His rise also relies on a strong religious discourse in which the gods justify his authority and expansionist ambitions. In his inscriptions, he presents himself as the defender of sacred order and the protector of Sumerian tradition. However, his political program suffers from structural weaknesses, particularly logistical and military, which allows Sargon of Akkad to turn the situation to his advantage. Pre-Sargonic Mesopotamia is marked by strong urban vitality. The cities, although small, are densely populated. They are fortified with mud brick walls and house buildings such as ziggurats, dedicated to worship. These cities are organized into residential quarters, workshops, and commercial warehouses, and practice irrigated agriculture. Palaces and temples manage supplies and organize trade expeditions to Susiana, Dilmun, or the Indus Valley. Exchanges with northern Semites promote Akkadian, while scribes maintain Sumerian to preserve the scriptural tradition. This linguistic coexistence reflects a heterogeneous society in which elites seek to expand their influence and forge political alliances. Each city-state has its own pantheon while acknowledging the supremacy of more widely revered deities. Priests play a key role, ensuring that rituals are performed to maintain prosperity and divine favor. War is perceived as a divine decision. Before each campaign, the ruler consults omens to ensure the gods' support. Victory confirms divine favor, while defeat is seen as a punishment. Defeated cities may even have their divine statues taken away, an act of humiliation that strips the city of its divine protection and forces its inhabitants to recognize the superiority of the victor. The pre-Sargonic Sumerian world is made up of independent cities, connected by complex economic, cultural, and religious networks, yet often divided by conflicts over water, land, and influence. The politico-religious system rests on the Ensi or Lugal, whose legitimacy stems from a connection to the divine realm. The tensions between Umma and Lagash, the rise of Lugal-Zaggisi, and the coexistence of Sumerian and Akkadian form the backdrop to the rise of Sargon of Akkad. The Mesopotamian tradition, passed down through various cuneiform sources, recounts the story of Sargon of Akkad in a near-miraculous fashion. One of the earliest versions of this legend appears on a tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king of the 7th century before Christ, discovered during excavations in Nineveh. Thanks to this document, historians have been able to reconstruct the birth and youth of this exceptional figure. Sargon is described as a child, destined for an extraordinary future, although he came from neither royal blood nor a prestigious lineage. Sargon's mother, identified only as a priestess with no name or specific order mentioned, may have been affiliated with an important temple in Kish. At the time, Mesopotamian cities were heavily influenced by the clergy, who were involved in rituals, administration, agriculture, and education. However, the arrival of an unrecognized child at the temple was problematic. The Ashurbanipal tablet recounts that the mother found herself unable to raise her son due to vows of chastity or the stigma of an illegitimate birth. She then decided to abandon him, and the image of the reed basket coated in bitumen to make it float is one of the most famous details of this account. Entrusting a newborn to the Euphrates evokes ancient stories of miraculous rescues. The river, essential for agriculture and trade, also symbolized great danger. An infant risked being lost to the currents or drifting into desert areas. Thus begins the life of one who would later become a great empire builder, a child left to fate, reliant on chance or divine will to survive. According to the Ashurbanipal tablet, Sargon's mother actively prepared for his departure. She coated the basket with bitumen, a material commonly used in Mesopotamia, to waterproof boats and containers. This act, performed with care, was meant to give her son the best chance of survival despite the abandonment. She then set the child adrift on the Euphrates. To a modern audience, this scene may seem both tragic and mythical. However, in the context of the time, it reflects the fear of a secret birth outside strict religious and social norms. Sometimes, extreme solutions were needed to avoid punishment, highlighting the rigidity of Mesopotamian standards. Although the city-states competed with each other, they often shared similar codes, where the birth of a priestess's child without official recognition could cause serious issues. Thus, Sargon's abandonment on the river may have been both a desperate sacrifice and a hope for salvation. After drifting for several days, the basket carrying the infant was discovered by Aki, the royal gardener of Kish. This modest figure, mentioned in later texts, tended the green spaces and irrigation canals that were vital to the city's survival. Water management was crucial in Mesopotamia, as canals supplied the city with water and fertilized the land. Finding the basket near a branch of the river, Aki immediately understood that it held an abandoned newborn. Seeing his fragility, he chose to adopt him, thus offering the child a chance at life. This act of compassion marked the first turning point in Sargon's legend. Without Aki's intervention, the child might have died without a trace. Though a servant, Aki's recognized role at the palace enabled him to provide a home for the child. Aki's generosity fits within Mesopotamian values, where piety was seen as a way to attract divine favor. Sargon grew up in Aki's care, helping him maintain the canals and manage the palace gardens. This episode likely took place around 2350 before Christ, during a time of political upheaval between Sumerian and Akkadian cities. Although the earliest version of the Legend of Sargon comes from the Ashurbanipal tablet, the story likely circulated earlier through oral tradition or previous written copies. At the Kish court, he learned manual labor and the management of water. The canals, vital to the agrarian economy, structured the city through channels and reservoirs. Sargon quickly gained skills in hydraulic engineering, especially in irrigating grain fields. This expertise would later influence his logistical and military management, providing him with a sense of organization that would shape his rule over a vast and complex territory. Sargon did not remain merely a laborer or apprentice gardener. He received a more advanced education under the guidance of palace scholars, where mastery of cuneiform was a privilege reserved for the elite. This knowledge opened the door to coveted administrative positions. Learning cuneiform was arduous, requiring the memorization of many signs with multiple meanings. The legend tells that Sargon stood out for his speed in acquiring advanced skills in accounting and logistics, which allowed him to be noticed at the court of Kish. Although Aki, the gardener, did not have these skills, the palace of Kish housed various specialists who facilitated Sargon's integration. He shone with his initiative and his ability to understand complex administrative methods. This social ascent, although rare in a stratified society, is a testament to Sargon's exceptional intelligence and charisma. As he grew up, Sargon caught the attention of the king of Kish, Ur-Zababa, who ruled a key kingdom in southern Mesopotamia. Kish was a place where Sumerian and Akkadian were spoken in a culturally rich environment. Ur-Zababa, according to records and legends, had a court composed of advisors, military leaders, diplomats, and officials. It was in this context that Sargon obtained a rare position, cupbearer, or the king's cupbearer. This role went far beyond serving drinks. The cupbearer was one of the king's closest servants present at banquets, validating the safety of food and ensuring his security. In ancient Near Eastern societies, a cupbearer who gained the king's trust could wield significant political influence. For Sargon, this position was a major springboard. From mere orphan, he found himself at the heart of city life, alongside the monarch, observing the mechanics of power. Sargon's rapid ascent quickly generated tensions at the court of Kish, marked by rivalries between influential families, priests, and military leaders. The arrival of a protege of the royal gardener, promoted to cupbearer, likely stirred jealousy and mistrust. Although texts do not detail the intrigues, it is evident that Sargon's integration into this elite was not met with unanimous approval. In this context, a dream of King Ur-Zababa, seen as a divine message, was decisive for his relationship with Sargon. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that dreams were channels of divine communication, and Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and sovereignty, was particularly powerful. In the dream, she crowned Sargon, a sign of a transfer of royal legitimacy. For Ur-Zababa, this threatening omen symbolized a genuine danger to his power. Ur-Zababa's terror in the face of this dream lay in the belief that sovereignty depended on divine approval. If Ishtar chose another favorite, it signified her disapproval of the current king, leading to defeat or abandonment. Cuneiform tablets frequently mention signs of divine displeasure, such as military defeats, natural disasters, or the emergence of a rival. For Ur-Zababa, seeing his cupbearer invested by the goddess in a dream heralded dispossession, likely fueling panic and resentment at court. His opponents viewed it as a sign of Sargon's growing influence. The legendary account portrays Sargon as a measured man, aware of the danger of royal jealousy. He did not boast about the dream, preferring discretion to exhibitionism. Assurbanipal's tablets suggest that the atmosphere at the palace was becoming tense. Some scholars believe Ur-Zababa had contemplated quietly eliminating Sargon, perhaps through exile or a more sinister plan. In the Mesopotamian world, omens often dictated the decisions of kings. Divinatory practices were well developed, including hepatoscopy, the observation of birds, and dream analysis, which guided political and military choices. When Ur-Zababa had a troubling dream involving Ishtar and a symbolic coronation of Sargon, he understood the gravity of the warning. Although this narrative may be a legend, these beliefs certainly influenced his reactions. Convinced that his cupbearer was chosen by the goddess, he now had to consider a wary, if not hostile, coexistence. Sargon's presence, modest yet charismatic and capable, quickly became untenable for the king. The shadow of conspiracy loomed over the palace of Kish. It is unclear whether Sargon sought alliances or relied on divine protection, but his journey, from an orphan taken in by a gardener to a favorite of the gods, illustrates how swiftly circumstances could shift. Politics and religion were closely intertwined. A divine sign could quickly alter a situation, as in Sargon's case, where Ur-Zababa's dream triggered mistrust and paradoxically enhanced his reputation. Sargon, abandoned on the Euphrates River, was taken in by Aki, the gardener of the palace of Kish. He received a technical and intellectual education, becoming one of the closest collaborators of the king. This rapid rise fueled the jealousy of his superiors. Ur-Zababa's dream, where the goddess Ishtar places the crown on Sargon's head, symbolizes his exceptional destiny and the opposition he will encounter. It would not be without turmoil, and the reigning king would attempt to neutralize him. This legend illustrates how the ancients explained destiny and the legitimacy of power. Sargon is not just an ambitious man, but one whose fate is marked by divine protection. The concrete details of the narrative, such as the use of bitumen and irrigation canals, ground this story in the reality of Mesopotamia, merging religious beliefs with pragmatism. Sargon's childhood, marked by abandonment and adoption, ends on the threshold of the royal court, an unstable place where the intrigues and suspicions of Ur-Zababa lead him into a series of revealing events. His story transitions from that of a young man with recognized qualities to that of a rival for the throne, set in a context of divine beliefs and political struggles. Even if he is still just the cupbearer, the prospect of his exceptional destiny is already taking shape. In the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ, the city of Kish, located in lower Mesopotamia, southern Iraq today, is experiencing a major political crisis. Once a major center of Sumerian civilization, it is home to Sumerian and Semitic populations, the latter gaining influence. Around 2350 before Christ, according to later inscriptions, the city is torn by a dynastic crisis. The Sumerian factions, which value the role of the priest-king, clash with the Semitic elites, whose Akkadian language is becoming dominant in administration. It is in this context that Sargon, once exiled and unknown, takes control and founds the city of Akkad. Kish is distinguished by its intertwined religious and political institutions. The palace of the sovereign often coexists with temples dedicated to tutelary deities. The king, linked to worship and agricultural rites, plays a sacred role, particularly in irrigation and the fertility of the fields. However, some Semitic factions attempt to erode the power of the Sumerian elites, leading to increasing instability. The cuneiform tablets discovered later reveal a political effervescence that will lead to a direct confrontation. Sargon, whose origin remains debated, appears in this context. Traditionally of Semitic descent, he favors the Akkadian language in his inscriptions. Sometimes referred to as the exiled, some accounts mention his forced departure from Kish during the Troubles. Although the details remain unclear, this flight or sidelining precedes his rise, and he establishes connections beyond the walls of Kish, particularly along the waterways of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, linked by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, is traversed by city-states competing for a sphere of influence. Military alliances and conflicts over water shape the lives of agricultural populations. Sargon exploits these networks, especially that of the Euphrates, to recruit mercenaries, who are either nomadic fighters or professionals ready to sell their services. Many cities seek armed forces, and itinerant leaders offer their expertise. Sargon, drawing on his past in Kish, attracts warriors frustrated by poverty or political rivalries. Recruitment along the Euphrates takes several forms: promises of loot, land to cultivate, military glory, or a place in the future administration. Sargon, exploiting grievances against Kish, presents himself as a just and legitimate man, ready to establish a new order. The scribes, eager for more recognition, see in him a ruler sensitive to administrative issues and the consolidation of central power. He becomes the first ruler to integrate many scribes and administrators into his entourage, recognizing the importance of resource management and writing. With this support, Sargon launches the capture of Kish, described as a swift operation. Soldiers gather around the city to seize its access points. The ruling power, weakened by internal intrigues, is too frail to resist. Some accounts suggest that the population of Kish, particularly artisans and scribes, welcomed this exile. The local administration, tired of instability, saw in Sargon a restorer of order. After the conquest, a council of elder notables legitimizes his victory, although it remains unclear whether this recognition was voluntary or imposed. Sargon's alliances with oppressed artisans and scribes reflect an original strategy. Unlike other claimants who rely on the nobility or clergy, he recognizes the importance of scribes, essential for transactions and economic management, as well as artisans, the producers of tools, weapons, and utensils. By integrating them into his project, Sargon secures their political support and benefits from their expertise. Thus, the conquest of Kish is not merely a military event, but heralds a new policy where diverse social groups reinforce royal power. After capturing Kish, Sargon realizes he must establish a capital marked by his own imprint. He founds the Agora of Agado, later known as Akkad. Although its exact location remains uncertain, Akkad is undeniably documented in cuneiform tablets and royal inscriptions. The name Agad may mean fortified place, or place of the throne, and the region ruled by Sargon and his successors would take the name Land of Akkad. Regarding architecture, the term agora evokes a public space or marketplace, though its exact Sumerian or Akkadian equivalent is unclear. Scholars believe it was a center for trade and political gatherings. Sargon's urban project includes the construction of walls, temples, and administrative facilities to support a flourishing administration. The difficulty in locating Akkad may be due to changes in the Euphrates course or the reuse of building materials in other cities. In parallel, Sargon adopts the title Sharu Khan, or legitimate king, symbolizing the divine legitimacy of his rule. This legitimacy rests on the support of Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and fertility, who becomes the protector of Sargon and his heirs. Ishtar is depicted as having entrusted supreme destiny to Sargon, who thus presents himself as the monarch chosen by the gods to establish a stable and prosperous order. This title, beyond its symbolic dimension, also serves as a powerful tool of propaganda. While Sumerian terms such as Lugal, king, or Ensi, priest-governor, are common, the use of a Semitic form to designate the king aims to send a clear message to the Akkadian peoples. It shows that the sovereign is not only a king for the Sumerians or Kish, but for all of Lower Mesopotamia, thus unifying scattered or hostile populations. Sharu Kechan means the king is established, the king is legitimate, a legitimacy stemming from military conquest, divine support, and the will to create a vast state. Sargon's propaganda also relies on the use of symbols, cylinder seals, used to authenticate documents, spread widely, and bear motifs celebrating his victories or his anointing by Ishtar. These objects help forge the image of a sovereign divinely supported. The scribes, now allies, describe Sargon as a reorganizer of the world, close to the gods and benevolent toward his allies. His capital, Akkad, becomes a tangible symbol of this renewal. Akkad, whose glory endures long after Sargon's death, becomes the symbol of a new era. By breaking the model of rival city-states, he establishes a political and administrative center capable of rallying both Sumerians and Akkadians. The founding of Akkad marks the birth of a capital ex nihilo, embodying the authority of the new power and reinforcing Sargon's personal ascendancy. Later, legendary accounts describe Sargon as the first great conqueror, but the reality of his power rests on his tactical skill, unifying rhetoric, and ability to bring together diverse social groups, mercenaries, scribes, and artisans. Sargon succeeds in overthrowing Kish and relocating the political center to a new city, whose exact location remains an archaeological mystery. Due to the partial documentation from the time, it is difficult to determine whether the coup d'etat caused massive destruction in Kish or if its integration occurred in a quickly stabilized climate. Some historians believe that the old dynasty, already divided, collapsed more than it was defeated, thus facilitating the city's takeover. Regardless, Sargon finds himself at the head of a determined military force and an evolving administrative apparatus. His authority, linked to the goddess Ishtar, will gradually extend to other city-states. The greatest feat remains this: an exile, leading a swift operation, founds the city that will soon become a major center of the ancient Near East. The mercenaries who follow him form the backbone of his legion, reinforced by local contingents. Their loyalty is based on the lure of plunder, the appeal of a powerful future leader, and ceremonial ties to Sargon, who is presented as divinely mandated. The scribes at the Akkadian court develop a form of writing adapted to the Akkadian language, breaking free from Sumerian conventions. The standardization of this cuneiform writing will make Akkadian a diplomatic language of the Fertile Crescent. The foundation of Akkad marks not only a political and military act, but also initiates a cultural dynamic that will influence the region for centuries. In the early years of Sargon's reign, the city under construction experiences a great fervor. Architects from Kish and elsewhere build strong walls protected by watchtowers. Materials are transported by river via the Euphrates. Merchants settle in, drawn by the promise of a new market and an administration collecting taxes. Archives and artifacts show that intense urban activity characterizes Akkad: construction of canals, expansion of residential areas, temples dedicated to Ishtar or other deities. The meeting space, sometimes interpreted as an agora, was not only an economic forum, but also a site for rites, royal proclamations, and military gatherings. Sargon's title, Sharu-kin, becomes a slogan, a legitimization of his power by the goddess Ishtar. Each inscription or official act underscores his exceptional character and his status as a king chosen by the gods. For the first time, this ideology exceeds the scope of a city-state, asserting that Sargon reigns over a set of territories unified by an ambitious cultural and political project. Although the empire takes clearer shape through future conquests, the founding act resides in his self-proclamation as legitimate king in a new city that unites a mosaic of ethnic and linguistic groups. The coup d'état of Kish and the foundation of Akkad mark a turning point in Mesopotamian history and in the universal history of the first great centralized states. In this tumultuous context, Sargon presents himself as a liberator, a war leader, and a builder. His project, supported by divine legitimacy, is embodied in a city dedicated to his cause, destined for greatness. The tension between Semitic and Sumerian factions gives way to a superior authority capable of proposing a vast organizational model. Archaeology struggles to locate Akkad, but its memory persists through later sources, attesting to the success of the endeavor. The foundation of Akkad results from political, social, and religious factors, enabling an exiled leader to embark on one of the most remarkable phases of Mesopotamian history: the decay of power in Kish, the rise of the Semites, the frustration of artisans and scribes, the support from mercenaries, and adherence to a cult of Ishtar condense into an institutional revolution. The title, Sharu-Kikarn, symbolizes both rupture and continuity: rupture with the old order, continuity in the lineage of sacred kings in Mesopotamia. It is at this precise moment that the idea of a unified kingdom under a strong sovereign emerges. Sumerians and Semites, through their ancient rivalry, unite their forces to create a vast territorial entity, with Akkad as the epicenter. The fragility of this empire, confronted with climatic hazards, external pressures, and internal revolts, is evident. Yet, at this moment of the coup d'état, Sargon's military fervor, legitimized by divinity, seems to triumph. Akkad is founded, and the name Sharu-Kitchan becomes the symbol of a radical transformation in Mesopotamian geopolitics. Without the internal divisions of Kish, without Sargon's political skill, Akkad would never have come into existence, and it is this paradox, a wavering power creating a nascent empire, that gives grandeur to Sargon's story. The conquest of Lower Mesopotamia by Sargon of Akkad demonstrates how a determined military leader was able to unify the Sumerian city-states and establish a centralized power. Around the middle of the 3rd millennium before Christ, the region was dominated by numerous city-states, some of which had strong political and religious traditions. Lugal-Sagesi, who ruled over a coalition of Sumerian cities, proclaimed himself Lugal and sought to subjugate his neighbors to bolster his authority. Before Sargon, he seemed to be the undisputed master of the region. However, a series of battles would change the balance of power. We will examine the campaign led by Sargon against Lugal-Zaggisi, the fall of great cities like Uruk and Ur, the public humiliation at Nippur, and the proclamation of a new titulature unifying Sumer and Akkad. These military victories were accompanied by hydraulic reforms and a symbolic gesture, the bathing of Sargon's sword in the waters of the Persian Gulf, illustrating his hegemony. Lugal-Zaggisi, sometimes referred to as the first monarch to have unified most of the Sumerian cities under his authority, represented a considerable challenge for Sargon. He was not only a charismatic leader, he had seasoned military forces and a vast network of alliances. His power extended over pivotal urban centers like Uruk and Ur, which played a central role in the trade of barley, textiles, and manufactured goods. Sensing the threat that Sargon could pose, Lugal-Zaggisi had not hesitated to strengthen his defenses, station garrisons at strategic points, and fortify the main canals. He knew that Upper Mesopotamia, from where Sargon came, was beginning to be stirred by dynamics of political recomposition. The rise of Akkad, the new capital erected by Sargon, indicated a clear expansionist agenda. Yet, Sargon did not content himself with amassing troops in the shadows. He was also working to prepare the diplomatic ground. Tablets discovered centuries later in various cities bear witness to an effort to forge agreements with some Sumerian notables opposed to Lugal-Zaggisi. Some urban elites, disappointed by his overly authoritarian politics, saw in Sargon a viable alternative, even a liberator likely to redefine the power balance. The fortifications of Lower Mesopotamia, although solid, could not withstand if a portion of the local populations provided support, even if only by supplying provisions or military intelligence. This web of alliances, carefully woven, prepared the ground for the boldest campaign of the time. When Sargon's army marched, it comprised fighters from diverse origins. Some Akkadian contingents, troops raised from city-states that joined either by force or freely, and sometimes mercenaries lured by the promise of loot. Later sources, replicated in propagandistic inscriptions, likely exaggerate the numbers, claiming that Sargon commanded thousands of professionals. But it is clear that he aligned a critical mass of soldiers sufficiently well-disciplined and motivated to assault reputedly impregnable strongholds. In Sargon's mind, victory was not merely a military objective, it was a political and spiritual ambition, as the domination of Lower Mesopotamia guaranteed control of the great temples and vital canals for agriculture. The first major step of the campaign was the battle fought on the outskirts of Uruk. This city, considered in tradition to be one of the oldest in the region, held a very strong symbolic value. It housed, among other things, a sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Inanna, later assimilated to Ishtar, and its prestige was such that anyone who reigned over Uruk could claim a sacred legitimacy throughout Sumer. Lugal-Zaggisi was there, with part of his army, convinced that numerical superiority and the protection of the walls would ensure his victory. The stakes for Sargon were all the more considerable. Confronting Lugal-Zaggisi directly in his stronghold was the ultimate challenge. The battle likely began with a maneuver aimed at circumventing the outer defenses and seizing the peripheral canals. Ancient accounts emphasize Sargon's cunning, who supposedly feigned heading towards another sector before striking by surprise. Assisted by accomplices within the city or by herds driven against the walls, the attackers managed to breach the first lines of defense. A violent clash ensued in the very streets of Uruk, where Lugal-Zaggisi's soldiers held firm for several hours, or even several days, according to some later tablets. In the end, the tenacity and discipline of Sargon's troops prevailed. The The fall of Uruk had an immense psychological dimension. Witnessing one of the major cultural and religious centers of Sumer fall into the hands of a king from outside, an Akkadian moreover, caused a shockwave throughout the region. The inhabitants of Uruk, according to the accounts, surrendered in masses. Rather than deliver the city to a massacre, Sargon then chose to show a relative clemency towards the civilian population. He sought to present himself not as a barbaric conqueror, but as a new sovereign capable of respecting religious traditions and rallying the local elites. This attitude, both firm and measured, was meant to lay the foundations for a future stable government over the Sumerian lands. Buoyed by his success at Uruk, Sargon continued his advance towards Ur, one of the other great Sumerian metropolises, renowned for its monumental ziggurat and its economic importance in maritime trade in the Persian Gulf. Ur benefited from a strategic location, as the city controlled the mouth of the Euphrates leading to the sea, thereby ensuring part of the maritime exchanges with more distant lands. Lugal-Zagyesi had left a significant garrison to defend these key places, as losing Ur meant not only losing a thriving trading hub, but also alienating a massive revenue base that served to maintain the army. Sargon, aware of the highly symbolic and economic value of this new trophy, organized the siege methodically. The documents of the time allude to the use of primitive siege towers or ramps to breach the walls. Although the sources remain fragmentary, it seems that the confrontation was less lengthy than at Uruk. Sargon's already colossal reputation and the news of Uruk's fall would have demoralized the garrison of Ur. Ultimately, the city fell under Akkadian control, bringing Sargon considerable booty, composed of rare metals, cargoes of barley and textiles, but also skilled artisans that he could potentially employ in his future urban projects. The capture of Ur-Ningirsu, a local notable close to Lugal-Zagyesi, further accentuated the disarray of the cities loyal to the latter. Although the name Ur-Ningirsu is explained by the presence of the element Ningirsu, a tutelary deity of the city of Lagash, he nonetheless had an important administrative function in Ur. His imprisonment proved that Sargon no longer tolerated any political opposition from the Sumerian ruling families. This gesture dissuaded many potential resistors while allowing Sargon to further consolidate his authority. In the propaganda texts, the image of the triumphant king at Ur highlighted the almost inevitable nature of his progress. Each step conferred upon him an increased form of legitimacy, making him not only the victor, but also the guarantor of a new order in Lower Mesopotamia. If Uruk and Ur represented economic and cultural poles, it was at Nippur that Sargon demonstrated the full measure of his victory. Nippur was the religious heart of Sumerian Mesopotamia, as it housed the great sanctuary of Enlil, one of the supreme deities of the pantheon. Controlling Nippur meant not only seizing a prestigious center, but also legitimizing his conquests in the eyes of all, since Enlil was considered the god who conferred royal authority. It was thus at Nippur that Sargon allegedly orchestrated what the texts describe as a humiliating parade. Lugal-Zagyesi, captured and bound, was publicly exhibited before the population, forced to march in chains behind the victorious troops. The image of the great Sumerian conqueror reduced to impotence aptly illustrated the reversal of fortunes. In the many later myths and legends, this episode is portrayed as a nearly theatrical moment where the prestige of Lugal-Zagyesi crumbles as he makes his way to the foot of the sanctuary of Enlil. Sargon, for his part, presented himself as the instrument of a broader divine will that had deemed Lugal-Zagyesi unworthy to retain power. The choice of Nippur for this staging was not accidental. The population and the clergy were particularly sensitive to messages of religious legitimacy. It was not only about punishing an adversary, but also proving that the defeat of Lugal-Zagyesi was in accordance with a celestial design. According to some interpretations, Sargon also made offerings to Enlil to symbolize his respect for the deity. The message was clear. Sumerian civilization was to remain united under the aegis of a sacred king, except that this king was no longer one of their own, but an Akkadian. This episode allowed Sargon to reshape public opinion. The conqueror did not appear as a destroyer of traditions, but as the vector of a deserved punishment for an arrogant sovereign. Other sources suggest that this public humiliation also aimed to deter any potential rebellion. By witnessing the fate inflicted upon Lagash, no one would dare to challenge Sargon's military might. It was precisely within the sacred enclosure of Nippur that Sargon was able to announce the modification of his titulature to embrace the entirety of Sumer and Akkad. With these successive conquests, Sargon's authority now extended over the majority of the Sumerian plain and Akkad, which was the king's homeland, where a distinct Semitic language was spoken alongside Sumerian. Until then, each of the two blocks had maintained its identity, its culture, and its language in official documents. Sargon decided to take a symbolic step by declaring a new titulature that would incorporate both the Sumerian and Akkadian dimensions of his kingdom. Contemporary inscriptions mention that Sargon proclaimed himself Lugal Kalam Ma, king of the land in Sumerian, and Shar-Kishadi, king of the universe in Akkadian. This official bilingualism marked a break from the previous tradition where the royal function was almost exclusively proclaimed in Sumerian in the south. It demonstrated Sargon's intention to be not merely the sovereign of Akkad, but indeed the ruler of all the cities he had subdued. The scribes, now placed under the control of the Akkadian administration, were required to use both languages in diplomatic and religious texts. This evolution reflects a concern for legitimacy. By associating Sumerian with power, Sargon catered to the religious and administrative elite of Sumer, which could continue to venerate its deities and practice its cult, as long as it recognized Akkadian hegemony. Conversely, the official recognition of the Akkadian language bolstered the contingents and officials from the north, who were attached to the figure of Sargon as the guarantor of their interests. This dual linguistic status hinted at the principle of a shared administration, even if the real power still belonged to a clearly Akkadian dynasty. Later texts often emphasize this forced alliance, while also recalling that Sargon had managed to avoid the pitfall of too brutal repression of Sumerian identity, preferring to integrate it to better anchor his authority. Alongside these military victories and the adoption of new titulary, Sargon implemented an ambitious policy of hydraulic reforms. The canals of Lower Mesopotamia required constant maintenance, as the irregular flooding of the Euphrates and Tigris, combined with an increasingly arid climate, posed major challenges to agriculture and the supply of cities. The Sumerian cities had long possessed complex irrigation networks, but political instability and rivalries among neighbors sometimes led to the neglect or even destruction of certain dikes. By taking control of these urban centers, Sargon inherited problems of sedimentation, siltation, and even clogging of vital canals. He was aware that the economic survival of his empire depended on the ability to ensure stable drainage and to avoid conflicts related to water. Maintaining earth levees, creating new canals, renovating damaged dams. These colossal projects required the labor and coordination of specialized teams. By supporting these hydraulic works, Sargon consolidated his image as a protective king, concerned for the well-being of his subjects. Unlike a mere conqueror who plunders and destroys, He now presented himself as a builder. Local populations could see this as an opportunity to restore agricultural prosperity and pay homage to their deities. The Sumerian priests, sensitive to the idea that the gods reward just and benevolent princes, found here an additional reason to tolerate, even support, the new power. Improvements to the irrigation network also facilitated the transport of goods to Akkad. Thus, barley produced abundantly in the south was delivered more easily to the capital to feed the court and the army. At the same time, the northern regions, which were drier, benefited from a controlled redistribution. According to some administrative texts, Sargon had certain canals registered under specific names, as if he wished to mark his imprint on toponymy. This initiative would have served to remind every use of the hydraulic network of the central power that guaranteed its functioning. Moreover, the hydraulic reform constituted a political gift for many workers and artisans. The large construction projects mobilized local labor, offering opportunities in terms of wages and food rations. Sargon could thus justify his conquests. Far from devastating the Sumerian lands, he claimed to have unified them to better protect them and to bring them an economic and social renewal. At the end of his campaigns, Sargon had thus established his dominance over Lower Mesopotamia, subdued the most prestigious cities, and laid the foundations of a centralized administration. To crown this series of victories, archives report a striking episode which became one of the symbols of imperial authority. Sargon went as far as the Persian Gulf and plunged his sword into the salty water. This gesture, seemingly simple, carried a profound meaning. Lower Mesopotamia led to the Persian Gulf, sometimes referred to at the time as the Lower Sea, in contrast to the Mediterranean called the Upper Sea. To reach it was to prove that one had conquered the southernmost limit of the Sumerian Akkadian world. By plunging his weapon into these waters, it symbolized the aspiration to reign up to the ultimate frontier from one ocean to the other, according to some inscriptions. By washing his sword, Sargon was likely seeking to evoke the ritual purification of the blood from battles, attesting that he had fulfilled his duty by pacifying the region in the name of the gods. Later, chroniclers, copying this anecdote, often exaggerated the significance of the event, alluding to a desire to conquer the ends of the earth. But, placed in the context of the time, Sargon's gesture before the Persian Gulf was first and foremost an affirmation of control over maritime trade and trade routes. For to dominate the ports and waterways would imply the ability to tax goods arriving from the sea, such as copper from Oman or other exotic products. Indeed, Sargon wanted to impose the idea that he was now the sole interlocutor for everything concerning navigation in these waters. This conquest was enveloped in the aura of legends. Countless tales have described Sargon, standing on the coast, holding his sword or scepter, accompanied by his officers, facing the setting sun. Such a tableau emphasized the greatness of a ruler with a nearly mythical stature. In the eyes of the submitted cities, this act confirmed that there were no more obstacles, no unbeaten city between Akkad and the edge of the sea, no rival capable of contesting the sovereignty of the new master. Moreover, direct contact with the Persian Gulf also had a ritual function. In Mesopotamian beliefs, the marine waters could be associated with primordial chaos. Victorious kings had to establish their power over the most dangerous of expanses, as if to signify their ability to triumph even over the most outrageous forces. Furthermore, purifying the sword of all spilled blood meant entering a new phase, where the saber, cleansed of the stains of battles, became an instrument of governance. Some rites even involved plunging weapons into the water to remove all curses and to seal a pact with the marine deities. Although accounts abound in sometimes contradictory details, all emphasize the symbolic significance of this act. It crowned Sargon's military interventions, strengthened his legitimacy in the eyes of the gods and the people, and definitively established the idea that a new era had begun in Lower Mesopotamia. From this moment on, the Sumerian inhabitants had to accept Akkadian supremacy as a fait accompli. The king now ruled over territories vast enough to justify the term empire, even if the notion did not correspond exactly to our modern categories. The conquest of Lower Mesopotamia by Sargon of Akkad marks a decisive turning point. It involves a confrontation between rival powers, a spectacular overthrow of the sovereign Lugal-Zagesi, and the establishment of a new imperial power. From the Battle of Uruk to the surrender of Uruk, these events symbolize the birth of a universal power. In addition to his victories, Sargon distinguishes himself through his hydraulic reforms, showing that he was not only a conqueror, but also a builder. By washing his sword in the Persian Gulf, he asserts that the south is now secured to his cause, and his reign extends to the maritime borders. This conquest is at the heart of the genesis of the First Mesopotamian Empire. Sargon employs a clever strategy, combining military maneuvers, diplomacy, and propaganda to establish a unique legitimacy. He federates diverse populations while imposing an authority supported by religion and projects such as the refurbishment of canals. The cities of Sumer, unified with Akkad, enter a new order where the king is master of the land and of the gods. This victory embodies the emergence of an imperial ideal, influencing the following centuries. The main lesson of this conquest lies in the balance between military force and popular adherence. Without the power of his armies, Sargon would not have been able to defeat Lugal-Zagesi or take Uruk and Ur. But without his reforms, he would not have consolidated his empire. By linking the public defeat of his enemies to concrete measures to stabilize agriculture and commerce, Sargon gains the trust of the religious and administrative elite. The key to his success lies in this blend of coercion and voluntary adherence. The conquest concludes in triumph for Sargon, who captures the major urban centers, centralizes power, and reinforces his name. The image of Lugal-Zagesi chained in Nippur remains a symbol of the price of failure for anyone who would challenge the new master. But it also carries a message of hope for the population, whom Sargon reassures by restoring hydraulic order and honoring local deities. This conquest marks a foundational step. For the first time, a sovereign unifies Sumer and Akkad, reunites the canals, the temples, and a seasoned army, while positioning himself as an heir to a double cultural heritage. Sargon, the conqueror and builder, thus seals his hegemony over Lower Mesopotamia. Sargon of Akkad, in consolidating his power in Lower Mesopotamia, harbors the ambition of extending his empire from ocean to ocean, a phrase that evokes territorial control extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This desire to unify the main waterways and trade routes of the Fertile Crescent marks a turning point in the imperial history of the ancient Near East. To better grasp the scale of this project, it is essential to detail Sargon's military and political maneuvers, exploring his progress eastward, northward, and westward, as well as the administrative and archaeological impacts of this epic. Sargon turns to the east, towards the kingdom of Elam, located in present-day southwestern Iran, a historical rival of the Mesopotamian cities. Susa, a key city of Elam, becomes a strategic target for Sargon, who raises an army after unifying Lower Mesopotamia. The city lies at the crossroads of several trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Iranian highlands. Elam, rich in metals and agricultural resources, represents a major stake. Sargon's conquest of this region pits the Akkadian army, modern and well-structured, against a regional power with well-established traditions. Sargon's victory is confirmed by the capture of statues representing the goddess Nerundi, brought back to Akkad. This symbolic gesture affirms Sargon's victory and dominance over the Elamite religious sphere, a common practice in antiquity to mark a new power. This campaign expands Akkad's influence, securing trade routes to Upper Mesopotamia and the Zagros Mountains. Sargon thus takes a key step in the construction of his empire. After consolidating his authority in the east, Sargon turns to the north and the west, strategic areas along the Euphrates, essential for transportation, migration, and military projection. The Akkadian army must control key cities and passes to neutralize any threats. Although fragmentary, cuneiform sources mention major milestones of this advance, such as Mari, Ebla, and Tutul, located along the Euphrates or in its vicinity. Mari, located in western Upper Mesopotamia, present-day Syria, controls access to crucial trade routes, particularly towards the Mediterranean. Taking Mari opens a passage to distant territories and secures the route for tin. Although protected by fortifications and its own policy, Mari is ultimately conquered by the Akkadian war machine. Archaeological excavations attest to Akkad's influence on the region's trade axes. Further north, Tutul, also mentioned in the archives, allows control of the fords of the Euphrates, vital for crossing the river quickly. Sargon establishes garrisons there to secure trade flows and maintain peace in the conquered territories. Ebla, rich in royal archives discovered in the 20th century, mentions a ruler named Sherugi, or Sa'argi, often interpreted as Sargon. Although this mention is fragmentary, it attests to Akkadian influence reaching the Syrian cities bordering the steppe, illustrating the ability of centralized power to reach distant territories in a short time. A significant episode of Akkadian propaganda is the March to Byblos and the Mediterranean. Byblos, on the coast of present-day Lebanon, was a renowned port for exporting cedar wood, highly prized by neighboring powers. In the narratives, Sargon claims to have reached the Upper Sea, an Akkadian Sumerian term designating the eastern Mediterranean. This conquest would have extended the Akkadian Empire, bordered by two seas, the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. However, archaeological evidence is limited, and the logistical organization of such a campaign was colossal, requiring substantial resources. Despite historians' doubts about the reality of this advance, the image of Sargon reaching the Mediterranean has marked the Mesopotamian collective imagination. It is echoed in inscriptions to celebrate his grandeur. Some later versions mention steles erected to commemorate his presence. Whether Sargon reached Byblos or sent emissaries remains debated, but this idea reflects his desire to control trade routes. The wood, wine, and other goods from the Syro-Lebanese coast were essential to the Mesopotamian plains. Sargon's objective was not only military, but also geostrategic, aiming to control trade and ensure the economic prosperity of his empire. The military administration is a key element of Sargon's expansion. He maintains a permanent elite troop of 5,400 men eating with him, an expression that illustrates the nature of the Akkadian army, one of the earliest professional military forces. Sharing the royal meal is not just an honor. It involves continuous maintenance, food, housing, and pay. This allows the Akkadian army to be mobilized quickly, unlike traditional armies composed of peasant militias or occasional contingents. This professional and homogeneous army enables Sargon to lead long and distant campaigns. Records found in Ebla, Mari, and other sites testify to the regular movements of Akkadian soldiers. These men also play an administrative role. They ensure the security of tributes, collect taxes, and oversee the implementation of Sargon's orders in the conquered territories. Officers trained in cuneiform writing, draft reports, and keep accounts of taxes in grain and metals. The influence of this structure on military and state organization in the Near East endures well beyond Sargon's reign. Alongside the internal documentation that quadruples Sargon's reputation, echoes of his exploits appear in foreign texts, including the tablets from Ebla. Discovered in the 20th century, these archives demonstrate the political, economic, and religious life of northern Syria at the end of the 3rd millennium. Among them, there are references to a ruler named Sharugi, or Sar-Rugi, believed to be the transliteration of the Akkadian name Sharu-Kyan, Sargon's title. Although this link remains debated, it shows the extent of interactions between the court of Ebla and Akkad. The texts mention shipments of luxury goods, indicating a trade and diplomatic connection. It remains uncertain whether these archives depict a submission or a negotiated alliance, but they emphasize Sargon's influence and his empire. The mention of Shah-Rugi is not just an anecdote. It proves that Sargon is not a legendary figure. These archives, written in almost real time, paint a political portrait of the era: commodities, treaties, marital exchanges, offerings, etc. They reveal a complex Near East, with city-states, kingdoms, and tribes. Sargon plays a key role, showing that his actions went beyond military conquest, aiming also to integrate into regional diplomatic relations. The scribes of Ebla rarely mention foreign rulers, making the reference to Sharugi all the more significant. For historians, it confirms the growing solidity of the Akkadian Empire, perceived as an indispensable player. Beyond the conquest of Mari Ebla and the possible visit of Sargon to Byblos, a later tradition attributes to this king an expedition as far as central Anatolia, in the Cappadocia region, one of the main sources of tin at the end of the 3rd millennium. Tin, alloyed with copper, allows for the forging of bronze, essential for weapons, tools, and various prestige objects. Securing the supply of tin is therefore an economic and military priority. Later narratives, written after Sargon's death, depict him crossing mountains, defeating local confederations, and seizing vital deposits or trade routes for Mesopotamia. However, direct archaeological evidence is limited, and some doubt that Akkad ever maintained lasting control over these distant territories. Nevertheless, the idea of Sargon ruling over the tin routes enhances the legend of a sprawling empire. Although it is uncertain whether Akkad concretely dominated Cappadocia, it is clear that the empire was interested in securing tin supplies. Later archives, particularly from the Old Assyrian period, mention caravans of metals crossing Anatolia. After Sargon, Mesopotamia maintained commercial contact with this region. The memory of the Akkadian advance survives in various forms, sometimes mythologized. The essential point to remember is that Sargon's ambitions, whether real or exaggerated, aim to secure access to the economic circuits of the ancient Orient, crucial for building a lasting power. The expansion of Sargon to the east, north, and west marks a decisive step in the assertion of the Akkadian Empire, with legends of a breakthrough to the Mediterranean and Cappadocia. This project, unprecedented at the time, stands out from other Mesopotamian conquests, as Sargon creates an imperial structure capable of enduring. Several tangible facts testify to this momentum. The conquest of Elam and Susa, symbolized by the transfer of the statues of Narundi, the submission or alliance of Mari, Ebla, and Tutul, essential for securing the Euphrates, and the mention of Shaurugi in Syrian archives, proving Sargon's renown abroad. With a standing army of 5,400 men, Sargon establishes reactivity and a continuous presence in the conquered territories. This military organization will serve as a model for other Mesopotamian empires and the great states of the Near East, ensuring the surveillance of trade routes, the stability of borders, and a rapid flow of information. This arrangement marks the emergence of a regional administration, beyond the mere city-state. Finally, the symbolic scope of this expansion is immense, as Sargon embodies the conquering king, supported by the gods, particularly Ishtar, and granting himself the right to subjugate neighboring lands. This imperial ideology, born during his reign, will influence the great Mesopotamian dynasties, Assyrians, and Persians. Sargon's adventure, from ocean to ocean, marks a turning point in the history of great empires. Although archaeological evidence is partial in certain areas, the consensus among specialists indicates that Akkadian power largely extended beyond Lower Mesopotamia, redefining the political map of the ancient Orient. Territorial gains, administrative standardization, economic integration, and cultural prestige forged the foundations of an influential imperial state, even after Sargon's death. Although the Akkadian Empire later fragmented under revolts and climatic conditions, Sargon's trajectory remains the symbol of a comprehensive imperial project that resonates through the centuries. The capital of Akkad, founded by Sargon, embodies his military and spiritual authority over Mesopotamia. By the end of the 3rd millennium before Christ, this city represents an urban innovation with its orthogonal plan, facilitating the circulation of goods and administrative management. Unlike the Sumerian cities like Ur or Uruk, which are denser and centered around temples, Akkad stands out for its structured organization around the royal palace, administrative quarters, and early residential areas, affirming Sargon's power. At the center of the city stands a ziggurat dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, symbol of love, fertility, and war. This monument, visible from several kilometers away, represents the religious and symbolic support of the goddess to Sargon, affirming his power. Ishtar is revered as the protector of the king and guarantor of good order in the empire, and the ziggurat becomes a major landmark in the Mesopotamian landscape. To consolidate his power, Sargon centralizes taxes, both monetary and agricultural. Money, in the form of ingots or shekels, and barley, essential for feeding the populations, are collected by the scribes of Akkad. These resources are redistributed to sanctuaries, military garrisons, and local elites, ensuring the loyalty of officials, scribes, and priests. This centralized system replaces the autonomy of the Sumerian cities, and local leaders must now submit to Sargon's imperial power. Alongside the economic reorganization, Akkad becomes the center of a cultural transformation with the standardization of cuneiform writing. Previously dominated by Sumerian writing, cuneiform simplifies and standardizes under Sargon in an empire where the Akkadian language is used. This reform leads to the creation of Neo-Akkadian, a rationalized version of writing adapted to the Semitic phonology. The goal is to create a homogeneous administrative training throughout the empire, which translates into the multiplication of clay tablets bearing official seals. Imperial cylinder seals become a key tool of legitimation and control. Originally used to certify the identity or agreement of an official, they are now a royal symbol, validating official orders and documents. This normalization of seals under Sargon, supervised by the palace, is a central element of imperial bureaucracy. Each document bearing the seal guarantees Sargon's authority. To strengthen control over communication routes, a royal postal network emerged, considered one of the first long-distance relay systems. Supply posts were established every 25 kilometers along the main roads connecting Akkad to the major cities. Although the archives are patchy, there are traces of a messenger service transmitting orders and information rapidly. This system resembles that of the Hittite relays and appears to be a manifestation of the centralization of power under Sargon. Among the prominent figures of this period, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon and high priestess of stands out. A Sumerian city, housed an important sanctuary dedicated to Nana, the moon god. Enheduanna is often regarded as the first author whose identity is clearly attested in the history of world writing. Her texts, primarily hymns to the goddess Inanna Ishtar, exalt the divine power and the splendor of the temples. Unlike royal inscriptions that highlight the sovereign, her hymns emphasize the intimate relationship between the priestess and the goddess, as well as the role of the cult within the community. Her influence on the Akkadian Empire is significant. She combines Sumerian religious fervor with Akkadian authority, and her role as high priestess, which generates income for the Temple of is also political. On a religious level, this era marks the attempt to codify a pan-Mesopotamian pantheon. Each city had its tutelary god, but Sargon sought to create a religious consensus that encompassed both Sumerian and Semitic traditions. Enlil, venerated in Nippur, retains his role as the supreme god, while Ishtar receives a central role in Akkad, legitimizing the conquering dimension of the king. This duality illustrates the period. On one hand, Sargon respects tradition by acknowledging Enlil, and on the other, he places Ishtar at the heart of the Akkadian royal house. The sacrifices and libations offered to both Enlil and Ishtar symbolize a balance between northern and southern Mesopotamia. This codification goes beyond official rituals, encompassing cultural integration. Sargon seeks to ensure that each conquered city integrates into a larger whole, where local deities find their place in a common divine hierarchy. In legal texts, several major deities, including Enlil and Ishtar, are frequently mentioned to signify imperial unity. The priests of the border sanctuaries receive support from the Akkadian administration, provided they pledge allegiance to the sovereign of Akkad. This approach reinforces Sargon's legitimacy, establishing a multinational empire unified by a syncretic faith. This religious and political effervescence materializes through a strong cultural foundation. evident in the artistic production, reflecting Sargon's desire to forge an imperial identity. Besides cylinder seals, crafts and iconography develop, blending traditional Sumerian symbols, such as the winged bull and banquet scenes, with Akkadian elements, notably the representation of Ishtar in a helmet, wielding weapons or taming lions. Later discovered reliefs, especially in Nineveh and the Dila region, depict military processions and votive offerings bearing the emblem of Akkad. Scribes play a central role in spreading imperial ideology, encouraging scholars of various origins to adopt the new cuneiform standard and enrich royal and religious archives. This network of administrative, religious, and artistic practices weaves the foundations of Akkadian civilization, which will influence future eras. The royal postal network also reflects the desire for centralization. Administrative tablets found at sites related to Akkad mention royal messengers, or from subdued cities, who would relay along the route. It is estimated that the relays were spaced 25 kilometers apart, allowing this distance to be covered in a day's walk or on a donkey's back. Each relay had reserves of water, fodder, and space to protect the mail. A small contingent of soldiers ensured security there. This system allowed Sargon to transmit his orders efficiently, even over long distances, while receiving information about the needs of distant cities. This network supported the cohesion of the empire and enabled a rapid response to unforeseen events, including devastating floods. It was crucial for maintaining hydraulic infrastructures, such as dikes and canals, in order to avoid uprisings or famines. By linking logistics and spirituality, Akkad embodies a state that transcends Mesopotamia, with the figure of Ishtar and the Akkadian integrated into broader Semitic traditions. The ziggurat dedicated to Ishtar is not just a monument, but a place of rituals aimed at solidifying inner peace through divine grace. The ceremonies celebrate military victories, pray for crops, and intercede in the face of natural threats. The more the city devoted itself to Ishtar, the wider the divine protection extended. Numerous pilgrims, scribes, and artisans came to honor the Lady of Akkad in her colossal temple. This sanctuary symbolizes modernity and the dominance of the new Akkadian order over older sanctuaries like that of Nippur. Under this system, writing is essential, whether for tax records, official missives, or religious dedications. The adoption of Neo-Akkadian as a unified chancery language allows for greater coherence. However, the Sumerian language remains in use for cultic and literary compositions, particularly in scribal schools. Akkadian spreads through commercial and administrative contacts imposed by Akkad, marking the beginning of its role as the diplomatic language of the Near East. All this organization takes place in a particular politico-religious context. Sargon, not only a military leader, presents himself as a king inspired by the gods, intended to unite often rival autonomous cities. Akkad, a new city, becomes a symbol, free from cumbersome religious legacy, with Ishtar as the deity worshipped by all. By promoting this vision, Sargon aims to embody the supreme arbiter of religious harmony. The official ceremonies, whether royal or seasonal, take place in the ziggurat, with offerings and chants in Akkadian and sometimes in Sumerian, illustrating a desire for cultural inclusion. This approach creates a sense of sacred empire, where political power is inscribed within a sacerdotal framework. The appointment of Enheduanna at Uruk is part of a strategy to associate Akkadian royal blood with a major sanctuary, a symbol of Sumerian culture. In her hymns, Enheduanna incorporates Sumerian literary elements, such as religious laments, to celebrate Inanna Ishtar and the ascendancy of the royal house of Akkad. This religious fusion highlights the woman as a divine mediator, a figure rarely present in earlier official inscriptions. Under Sargon, the feminine sphere gains visibility, although power remains predominantly in the hands of the king. Enheduanna, as the first named author, underscores the importance of the Akkadian Empire for the emergence of signed literary works, a remarkable fact in antiquity. Governance, culture, and innovations under Sargon of Akkad reveal consistent measures aimed at strengthening a young and ambitious empire. The foundation of Akkad as the capital symbolizes an administrative network with an orthogonal urban plan, the construction of a sanctuary to Ishtar, the centralization of taxes, and the loyalty of the elites. The standardization of cuneiform writing in Neo-Akkadian and the use of imperial seals mark a turning point in the history of writing. The postal network allows for rapid and effective communication, anticipating the models of later empires. Enheduanna emerges as the guardian of a cult, blending Sumerian traditions and Akkadian aspirations. The codification of a pan-Mesopotamian pantheon, with Enlil as the supreme god and Ishtar playing a major role, reflects the balance between local heritage and imperial ambitions. These dynamics, present in Akkad, form a lasting legacy influencing future civilizations from Assyria to Babylon. In the last years of Sargon of Akkad's life, his empire was shaken by a series of crises that threatened the order he had established. At that time, the kingdom of Akkad, with its capital Akkad, extended over a large part of Mesopotamia. Sargon had reigned for several decades, having implemented numerous administrative, cultural, and fiscal reforms, including garrisons in key cities and a tax collection system. Yet, in these subdued cities, resentment was growing and uprisings erupted, often referred to as the Crisis of Sargon. A fragmentary text recounts that 34 cities simultaneously revolted against Akkadian control. These rebellions stirred all of Mesopotamia, from Kish in the north to more distant regions. Although the exact number of rebels is uncertain, this revolt posed a genuine challenge to Sargon's power, fueled by fiscal pressures, a sense of subjugation, and likely the weakening of an aging king. Sargon responded with swift repression, mobilizing military garrisons. His army, formed during expansion campaigns, moved quickly to regain control of the revolting cities, inflicting severe reprisals to punish the leaders and deter any further insurrection. In some cases, sieges occurred, but often the arrival of troops was sufficient to restore order, as the cities could not compete with the military organization of Akkad. Sargon also utilized religious symbolism to strengthen his repression. He had curses inscribed on border steles, reminding that any rebellion against him was a rebellion against divine will. These inscriptions aimed to bolster fear, marking the boundaries under the authority of the gods and punishing those who dared to destroy these symbols of power. The sovereign decided to crush the uprisings by resorting to force and curses to demonstrate his authority and reassure his supporters. Sargon, aware of the role of religion in legitimizing his power, presented himself as the favored of the goddess Ishtar, and power often played out between divine support and divine anger. Mesopotamian kings maintained close ties with temples and priests, who managed both religious administration and daily governance of the cities. However, the revolts indicated that ceremonies were no longer sufficient to quell popular discontent, making repression necessary to restore stability. Despite this troubled period, Sargon undertook public works, notably the construction of a monumental dam on the Tigris. The floods of the rivers could devastate the irrigated agriculture, essential to the economy of the empire. This dam aimed to control the river, protect populations, and improve water distribution, particularly in the more distant regions of Akkad. These works show that Sargon retained the ambition to strengthen the state beyond his own existence. The construction of the dam, even amid a climate tense from the revolts, illustrates his vision of a king as a guarantor of stability, a warrior, a builder, and a protector of religious balance. He wanted to leave a lasting legacy, despite the crises. Sargon's death occurred around 2279, marking the end of a long career highlighted by a final triumph against the rebellious cities. However, the end of his reign, characterized by tensions, foreshadowed challenges for his successors. The disappearance of a unifying monarch raised doubts about the cohesion of the empire, and defeated adversaries or regional governors might want to test the solidity of the new regime. Imperial succession was supposed to follow the direct lineage to ensure continuity. After Sargon's death, his sons Rimush and then Manishtushu ascended the throne. Rimush had to confront revolts in Lower Mesopotamia, likely led by local city leaders. Although tensions had not disappeared under Sargon, he managed to stabilize the situation, but the contestation returned under Manishtushu's reign. Manishtushu, faced with internal upheavals and resistance, continued the grand works of his predecessor and maintained alliances with the peripheral city-states. He also launched expeditions to recover the territories submitted by Sargon. Despite these difficulties, Sargon's dynasty maintained a cohesion that allowed the Akkadian hegemony to endure for several decades. Under the reign of Naram-Sin, son of Manishtushu, the empire entered what is often called the Golden Age. Naram-Sin proclaimed himself king of the four regions, signifying colossal hegemonic ambition. He deified himself, asserting himself as a living god, crossing a threshold that previous Mesopotamian kings had never dared to cross. This evolution was made possible by the legacy of Sargon, who had already centralized religious powers and strengthened his bond with the goddess Ishtar. The transition from Sargon to Naram-Sin shows how solid Sargon's legacy was. The administrative and military structures he set up did not collapse upon his death, allowing Naram-Sin to push his imperial project even further. The transition was facilitated by a standing army, a network of scribes, and a royal ideology that presented the monarch as an elected representative of celestial powers. The revolts of the 34 cities at the end of Sargon's reign highlighted the limits of the empire while revealing the power of its forces. These uprisings showcased the presence of centers of discontent ready to rise when conditions were favorable. However, the rapid suppression of these revolts testified to the strength of the Akkadian military infrastructure and the centralization of power. Both of these realities persisted under Rimush and Manishtushu, who pursued the same policy, quelling plots and pacifying turbulent regions while justifying their domination through divine protection. After Sargon's death, the empire, despite the turbulence, became a reference point. His successors continued his reforms and methods, maintaining the idea of a unified empire under a single monarch. This vision endured as a valuable legacy, with a unified Mesopotamia administered by a network of scribes and administrators. Cuneiform writing was standardized under the influence of Akkadian, and the balance between traditional Sumerian worship and imperial religiosity was maintained. The empire did not collapse immediately after Sargon's death, which shows that the institutions he had put in place were solid. However, these institutions were not enough to prevent internal conflicts. The kings who succeeded him until Naram Sin had to constantly monitor and suppress seditions, especially in distant cities. The Akkadian Empire, a stabilizer of the Fertile Crescent, was also a hotbed of tensions due to the desire for centralization that often led to reactions from cities with distinct identities. At the time of his death in Akkad, the climate was relatively calm. Sargon had crushed the insurrection and completed major public works. At the end of his reign, he contemplated a strong empire, aware of the work he was leaving to his heirs. He was not only a conqueror, but a builder king who had redefined the political structure of Mesopotamia. Through his ultimate repression of the rebellious cities, he ensured that no other power would rival his own as long as he lived. However, this end of reign, although marked by apparent stability, foreshadowed transformations to come. Rimush, Manishtushu, and then Naram Sin inherited a powerful yet fragile empire. Sargon had laid the foundations for a coherent empire around a new capital, Akkad, but his unique model of Mesopotamia faced many oppositions. The intertwining of civil and religious powers, royal propaganda, and the militarization of society strengthened power while polarizing the population. At his death, the empire he left behind was both admired and a source of discontent ready to explode. Thus, the last chapter of his reign is not a simple decline, but the epilogue of a life marked by major conquests and the establishment of an unprecedented empire. Sargon faced and overcame the gravest crisis of his empire by relying on his military apparatus, reaffirming his divine legitimacy, and pursuing projects of collective interest. At his death, he left a strong capital and a pacified territory, with his two sons ensuring the transition to the next generation. This generation, led by Naram Sin, would take the Akkadian Empire to new heights, notably with the deification of the living sovereign, an innovation for the time. At the time of Sargon's death, Mesopotamia was already undergoing transformation. Local revolts had not overthrown his hegemony, but had revealed flaws in his empire. These internal shocks reinforced the state and prepared the emergence of a quasi-divine royalty. Opposition, through its rebellion, paradoxically helped legitimize imperial authority. Sargon's successors understood the importance of responding quickly to local uprisings to maintain order. The legacy of Sargon resided in the very existence of the empire he left behind. The crisis of Sargon and the conflicts faced by his successors show that issues of centralization, religion, and military legitimacy persisted over generations. Naram Sin, proclaiming himself a god, illustrates this transition between the first generation of conquerors and the second of theocratic builders. The death of Sargon marked the end of the conquering king and the advent of a divine monarch. Sargon's legacy, shaped by the revolts he suppressed, transcended the borders of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian example, centered on Akkad, inspired many kings, including those of Babylon, Assyria, and other regions. His imperial model, supported by his armies and his ability to speak in the name of the gods, survived even after his death. The end of Sargon's reign, marked by uprisings and the succession of his sons, was crucial for the establishment of Akkadian power. The insurgents were mistaken to think they could take advantage of Sargon's old age. He remained strong enough to maintain his authority. His immediate legacy, passed on to Rimush and Manishtushu, was a lesson in firmness and centralization, ensuring an empire strong enough to endure after his passing. The Akkadian Empire, powerful under Sargon and his successors, began its decline at the end of Naram-Sin's reign, around 2254-2218 before Christ, and even more so under the following reigns. After his death, the central authority was eroded by political, military, and climatic factors. The monarch Shu-Turul, one of the last Akkadian kings, attempted to maintain Sargon's legacy, but his authority weakened in the face of external events and internal troubles, hastening the fall of the empire. The incursions of the Gutians, a people from the mountainous regions of the Zagros, were a major factor in this destabilization. Described as barbarians or raiders, their attacks on Akkadian cities further weakened the central power. Although Sumerian and Akkadian propaganda exaggerates their role, their actions contributed to the fragmentation of the empire. As Shu-Turul lost influence, several regions regained independence, facilitating the infiltration of the Gutians. At the same time, a major climatic phenomenon, the drought of 4.2 KO BP, disrupted agriculture and irrigation systems in the Fertile Crescent, making canal maintenance difficult. This climatic crisis, combined with internal uprisings and external pressures, reduced imperial legitimacy. The king, unable to ensure abundance and security, saw his power challenged by rebels and local adversaries. When the empire collapses and gives way to political fragmentation, the Akkadian memory persists. Material remnants, such as irrigation canals, bear witness to the ambition of Sargon and his successors. These structures, attributed to the Akkadian era, reflect a centralized organization aimed at unifying a vast territory. Cuneiform tablets found in Girsu and other ancient sites evoke large-scale canalization projects, reinforcing the idea of centralized hydraulic management. Another artifact, the copper tablet of Baseki, discovered near the village of Baseki in Uruk, illustrates the technical mastery of Akkadian artisans. It bears inscriptions that could refer to dedications or official acts, highlighting the importance of craftsmanship and metallurgy as symbols of prestige and economic power. The victory steles, although fragmentary, remind us of military exploits and royal propaganda, reinforcing the authority of Akkad. Even after their fall, the Akkadians leave a lasting literary imprint. Centuries later, literary compositions such as the Epic of Sargon continue to celebrate Sargon's accomplishments. Although the text is partially lost, Sargon's legacy as a conqueror and founder of a unified empire remains a historical and mythical reference. There exists at times an ode against the Gutians, a late text in the Sumerian Akkadian tradition, where the Gutians are presented as a divine scourge, punished for the pride of kings and the violence of conflicts. This text, in the tradition of prayers and curses, reinforces the idea that the end of the Akkadian Empire symbolizes a warning. The arrogance of kings, coupled with adverse circumstances, leads to divine punishment embodied by barbarian invaders. Thus, the idealized figure of Sargon becomes a symbol of warning for future generations against the excesses of imperial power. This cultural legacy is also reflected in the use of the title King of Akkad. Several Mesopotamian rulers, such as Hammurabi, 1792-1750 before Christ, will claim this heritage to strengthen their legitimacy. The prestige of Sargon, although the Babylonian Empire is different and later, remains an asset for kings seeking to expand their power. Similarly, the Assyrians, particularly under Assur-Sirpal II and Sargon II, consider themselves the heirs of this unification of Mesopotamia, using Akkadian imperial phrasing to legitimize their own reign. Although the Akkadian Empire lasted only a century and a half, its model has left a mark on the political imagination of the region. The Assyrians, under kings like Assur-Nasirpal II and Sargon II, create a military and administrative apparatus reminiscent of that of Sargon of Akkad. Later, the Persian Empire, circa 550–330 before Christ, incorporates certain aspects of the Mesopotamian imperial model, such as the network of royal roads for communication, foreshadowing Akkadian innovations in centralization. The concept of a universal empire, experienced by Alexander the Great and inherited by Rome, also finds its origins in the unification initiated in Mesopotamia. The proto-professional army of Akkad, with its 5,400 men dedicated to the protection of the king, becomes a model for the imperial military tradition, where a permanent body of warriors is essential to imperial authority. Similarly, the standardization of writing, with the Neo-Akkadian cuneiform, leaves a lasting legacy. The idea that a unique administrative language can unite diverse peoples, a logic that will be found in various empires, and even in modern governance, where the official language plays a key role in internal cohesion. The dynastic cult, with Naram-Sin wearing the divine tiara and calling himself a living god, marks a turning point in the theatricalization of power, which will develop among great conquerors. The Assyrians will adapt this divinization of the king, and the idea of a king embodying divine authority will be reinforced over time. In Egypt, pharaohs already practiced this union of earthly and divine power, but the Akkadian experience shows how a sovereign could appropriate this principle to strengthen his grip. The legacy of Sargon thus illustrates the importance of the sacralization of power. The fall of the Akkadian Empire and the legacy of Sargon mark the history of state power. Although the Sumerian Akkadian period is geographically and culturally limited, Sargon is one of the first to unite under a single authority peoples of different origins and languages. He established a central administration, governing distant territories, and a common religious order around deities such as Enlil or Ishtar, reinforcing the idea of a spiritual community. The notion of empire thus becomes concrete, based on armed forces, a unified bureaucracy, and an ideological narrative legitimizing expansion. This legacy extends beyond military and administrative aspects to touch the collective imagination. Sargon and his successors cultivated a rhetoric of invincibility, divine election, and universality, establishing the foundations of an imperial culture that will endure until the Roman period. The Epic of Sargon is one of the first narratives where the king becomes a mythological hero, chosen by the gods, a model that will be found in many civilizations. The memory of Akkad persists in political ideology, both within and beyond Mesopotamia. The name Akkad becomes legendary, and Babylonian or Assyrian inscriptions claim lineage with this heritage. Sargon is integrated into cuneiform historiography alongside the great kings of the past, like Gilgamesh. His figure becomes that of the providential man, and the tales of his childhood and rise to power feed the fascination for the archetype of the hero born from adversity. The Akkadian legacy represents a fundamental milestone in the emergence of the imperial idea, which relies on military strength, economic centralization, and divine legitimization to unite multiple peoples. Although the Akkadian dynasty disappears after the death of Shuturul, its model transforms and influences later kings, who will recognize the importance of a radiant administrative capital like Babylon, Nineveh, Persepolis, and a unifying discourse to rally local elites. The Akkadian Empire, far from being a simple political fact, was an institutional and ideological laboratory whose echo resonated for millennia. The Mesopotamians of the Uruk III period and the Babylonian era regarded Sargon and Naram-Sin as mythical figures, and the Assyrians, proud of their conquests, glorified Akkad. Later, the idea of a king dominating the land between two rivers would recall that of Sargon. In the 4th century before Christ, Alexander saw himself as the heir to these conquerors, while Rome perfected the art of projecting the empire. The principles of unity, administrative centralization, rapid communication, and sacred legitimization remain constant, reflecting a continuity that traces back to the high antiquity. Sargon's adventure reveals the origins of global state power, founded on the alliance between military expansion, unified administration, and ideological discourse. By proclaiming himself King of Akkad and affirming his divine lineage, he paved the way for many later states. To dominate a multi-ethnic space, it is crucial to coordinate finances, justice, the army, water management, and religious cults around a decision-making center. This model, evident in the construction of the capital Agade and the divine support of Ishtar, has marked subsequent imperial experiences. It established the permanence of a literate bureaucracy, a professional army, a common language, and a divine legitimacy of power. This framework, present throughout history, refers back to Sargon, the legitimate king who founded the first major empire. The fall of the Akkadian Empire, marked by the Gutian invasions and the hydraulic crisis of 4.2 KO BP, did not erase Sargon's influence. His memory, preserved by art and texts, continues to illuminate the notion of empire. The figure of Sargon remains a model or a warning, influencing the political legacy of antiquity. His violent downfall only cemented his role as a founding milestone, with lessons that inspired the imperial constructs of the following centuries. History does not close this chapter, but rather opens it onto the long tradition of centralized kingdoms and empires. In the collective imagination, Sargon embodies the man who started from nothing, becoming sovereign through divine favor and the discipline of his soldiers, marking the birth of world-scale power.